Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's program about authors, about their ideas, their works, and the themes that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri. I'm the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, and I'll be your host and moderator of this program. I'm delighted to welcome you all today. I also want to, before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, I want to say thank you, and FPRI says thank you to our members and partners whose generosity makes this program possible. We hope that if this is your first FPRI program, that you will consider becoming a member or partner of FPRI so that you can continue to support conversations very much like this one. There will be information provided in the chat function about FPRI, about our programs, and about the book we're going to talk about today. For those of you who want to add questions and ask questions of our guest today, I ask you not to use the chat function, but rather to use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of the screen, and I will work your questions into our conversation. But it's a delight to have you all here today, and it's a delight to have you here to meet with Professor Michael Gambone. So let's get started. The truth is out there, and I want to believe. Two lines that resonate with anyone of a certain age who has watched The X-Files, where the idealistic and determined Fox Mulder and his more pragmatic partner, Dana Scully, pursued a variety of bizarre plots and characters, followed by fans eagerly convinced that one more investigation would unearth the conspiracy behind everything. The belief that shadowy forces control our lives is both frightening and comforting. Frightening for the power such forces may have, and comforting because it can provide a logic and coherence to complex events, offering clear connections that obviate the need for detailed study or understanding of their complexities. Belief in conspiracies large and small has thus been a part of the human experience for as long as people have told stories. Even if they do not stand up to detailed, dispassionate scrutiny, conspiratorial beliefs often they offer important windows onto the priorities and worries of the societies that produce them, which means that the study of conspiracy theories can teach us a lot about what people believe and why they believe it. The truth may not be out there, but there are truths revealed in these theories. In his new book, Modern Conspiracies in America, Professor Michael Gambone offers a tour through some of the most influential conspiracy theories in our national life, from the JFK assassination to 9/11, from the protocols of the Elders of Zion to QAnon. Throughout, he encourages his readers to understand the context of these beliefs and their practical impact, helping us to see why conspiracy theories arise and what seekers of truth can or should do in response. So where do conspiracies come from? How should we talk about them? How do they relate to ongoing political disagreements? And hey, who shot JFK? These are some of the questions we will address today in our conversation with Dr. Michael D. Gambone. Dr. Gambone is the author of 9 books, including most recently Modern Conspiracies in America, Separating Fact from Fiction, and The New Praetorians, Modern American Veterans, Society, and Service in the Forever War. Dr. Gambone is a veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division. In 2006, he deployed to Iraq as a Department of the Army contractor and served in the city of Mosul. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Chicago and is currently a professor of history at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. And full disclosure, Dr. Gambone was a member of a graduate seminar in the fall of 1990 at the University of Chicago, which was the first graduate seminar that your humble host and moderator attended as a graduate student. So I am delighted to welcome to this conversation today, Dr. Michael Gambone. Hey, Mike.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's really great to talk to you today.
It's great. So I really want to know, I want to know more about the origins of this book. I understand that it comes from a course that you taught, but how did this come to be?
Well, I mean, it's funny you brought up Chicago because neither of us would in a million years think I'd be talking about this today. This kind of formed during sabbatical. I finally got my first sabbatical, and 2 things happened. I had lunch with one of my Penn State mentors, and she's retired but teaching an adult class, and she was actually teaching this topic, and I thought it was very intriguing because I had barely heard about any of this aside from maybe a brief mention from Arthur Mann in a class on 20th century social movements. But So that kind of planted the seed. And I have another friend from high school, and she basically believes in every conspiracy ever designed, and started forwarding me all these emails about YouTube videos. And I was astounded at what was out there. So I was pretty oblivious because I'm working on other things. But yeah, I put the class together. The first prototype had 25 students. This semester, I had 3 sections of 145. And
Really?
I've been continuously teaching it for 6 years. And it's grown to that point. It could probably be bigger, but I can only teach so many classes. But it was 3/4 of my load at one point. So yeah, it started and it really just took off from there. The kids really, I mean, it closes in a couple of days every time it's offered for scheduling.
And are the chapters in the book, do they reflect the topics that you hit most often in the class?
They do. It's kind of a book about history and pedagogy. So it basically, what I learned from the class, I applied in the book.
Yeah, and so because I noticed you start way back, and then you move but then several of the chapters are very present. So you start with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which seems to be the conspiracy for a lot of modern conspiracies, and also has a particular place in American conspiracy thinking. Tell me how you fit that, or how you begin with that.
I think you put it very well. You have all the basic elements that you see repeated constantly. So end of World War I, you've got this massive existential crisis. You've got people looking for answers. You've got a deliberate plotted misinformation. You've got a mogul with his own, corporate empire who's promoting this. And we have Henry Ford. We don't have the internet, but we've got the Dearborn Independent. So you've got all these different features of, what'll become a pretty, an interesting, consistent model. It's interesting to see, the London Times and Winston Churchill buying into this stuff, where, the Zionist becomes kind of this blanket word for, other bad scapegoat.
Right.
So you have that, but you also have the persistence of it. So I think you could work that narrative forward, but like you said, you could work the narrative about Jewish conspiracies back to, the Middle Ages and even earlier. So I thought that for the modern era, it's a very good place to start.
Yeah. Well, and because it does fascinate me to think that it's whenever major historical eruptions occur, it is, there's lots of people go looking for their explanation. It's a little bit like after the French Revolution, this is when they started imagining that the Masons were behind it all. Or that there had to be some kind of conspiracy behind it all. So what is it, do you think, that makes people, I want to be serious about this, and I don't want to be dismissive about people who believe these things. It's not just that people are dumb. It's not that people are gullible, even though there are plenty of dumb and gullible people in the world. But what is it that makes conspiracies appealing?
So this has been an interesting process in teaching for all these years, that I end up in other fields of study. And I used Rob Brotherton's book, Suspicious Minds, for this book and the class. And he's a psychologist. And I like that. I assigned a chapter where he talks about, the mental kind of prerequisites for a conspiracy. So he uses, clinical tests like the messy desk. And people want to rearrange things to make them make more sense. There's a natural desire to do it. There's also this kind of brainstem, animal brain suspicion of danger that we all have. So you've got elements of that create, the beginnings of this. But I think, like you mentioned in the intro, people want, or maybe need to take shortcuts, because a lot of the conspiracies I talk about are very complicated. We could be talking about ballistics in Kennedy or structural engineering in 9/11. And nobody, I wouldn't say nobody, but very few people really understand what that means. After, March of 2020, we all became immunologists, right?
Right.
So, we're throwing around terms and we really don't understand what they mean. So these conspiracies provide all these, they're basically tools. Most of them aren't good tools, but they make sense to the layperson when they need them.
A question that overall on this that interests me as well is the role of the internet. Because on the one hand, right, people use the internet and say that, well, it's because of the internet that it's easy to to spread these kind of theories. But interestingly enough, and I know you know this from doing your own research as a historian, the internet also makes it possible to find a lot of materials without having to travel very far from your office, right? You can find those government reports that explain the that explain the fires at 9/11, or that look into the development of geoengineering and chemtrails, which we will talk about in a minute. But do you think, is the internet and our social media, are they purely are they neutral forces in the growth and spread of conspiracies, because they can be used both to spread them and to debunk them?
I think they're a mirror, basically. The New Praetorians book I wrote, that's the first book I ever wrote because of COVID. I researched it completely online. And you're right. I mean, I can find and PDFs of, Veterans Administration reports from 1971. Right. For this book, I actually found Joe McCarthy's autopsy report. Yeah. So
amazing. Okay.
No, I mean, it's amazing what you can. I mean, I found, George Bush's transcripts from Yale. You can find almost anything like that that's incredibly useful. But what I'll borrow another term from Brotherton. I mean, the internet can also make, confirmation bias the norm. And we do this it's a habit, really. I mean, I have a pretty broad spectrum of friends on my internet for what I do on the internet, but that's not true for everybody. Right. And algorithms make that easier for us to do. I mean, that's part of the software as well as the platform. So it really depends on what the user does. It's not the internet per se. And I guess it's always important to remember that, right? We shouldn't blame inanimate objects for our problems, right? We create plenty of them on our own. Right. And one of the things that you do early in the book, right? You try to provide this toolbox for people or toolkit to understand things. And one of the points that you make that I think is very important for us to talk about is there is a difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. And I want you to tease that out as you describe it in the book so that we can talk about it a little bit. Yeah, I think, and I'm stealing these definitions from, august publications like a dictionary. But a conspiracy, basically, it's an evil plan conducted by a group. But one of the distinctions I make is that there are real ones. I talk about Watergate because that is a real conspiracy. It existed. Right. The distinction with a conspiracy theory, and it's pretty simple. And Catherine Olmsted's book on this was great. Real Enemies. A conspiracy theory is something that has yet to be proven. So the burden falls on the person using it to establish the evidence for it. And that's where I kind of lead the kids from the definition into the process. So, and, this is something we learned in school, you and I mean, you make a claim, you have to have a matching proof, and they have to have logical consistency. So, and I tell them this from day one. I said, this class is a Trojan horse for research methods, really. Yeah. And this is what I think, by the way, if anybody's watching this, right, there is not a conspiracy to shut down this conversation. I'm in my office and my lights just all went off because I was standing in one place and not moving around enough. I hope you can still see me. But this idea of, because the other thing is, right, that there are conspiracies. Right. We find things out. I mean, and I think about this as terrible as it is, there are conspiracies where people decide to do things and they work their way to make them happen. And yet, what's the difference? And where do you draw the line between sort of identifying an actual conspiracy, right? The Watergate conspiracy, for example, or how do we draw the line between identifying conspiracies and conspiracy theories? I think when I talk about Joe McCarthy, I mean, I use the term I use is parallel conspiracies. So you've got an ongoing Soviet effort to gain information on nuclear research. And there's a long list of perpetrators and conspirators. I mean, we know a lot of their names really well. Right. So that's on one level, you have that. On the other level, though, you have, Joe McCarthy making claims about other people who might be culpable. So you're jumping that line from causation to correlation. And that's where I'm trying to have them understand where that bright line exists if you're moving past that. And then we talk about, why would he do it? And I really like Oshinsky's book on this because he's defining an ambitious man. He's talking about a context where people are very afraid and uncertain about, the Third World War. So that's setting the stage for his willingness and ability to do it. So there are always kernels of facts in some of these, but you're also going to have a manipulation of them.
Mm-hmm. I think about that a lot. I mean, I think about, say, the relationship between 9/11 and the Gulf War, the second Gulf War.
Right.
The idea that one can argue that the one led to the other, or one provided a pretext for the other, especially because there were people who decided to make 9/11 a pretext. But that's not the same as arguing that 9/11 was done by the same people in order to make this possible.
And one of the ironies is when that story, or whatever version of the official story, starts to collapse, and it did after 9/11, it opens up this vacuum for the skeptics to jump right into it and say, look, they're lying, there must be more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And McCarthy did the same thing. I mean, my point is basically, I think he's the guy in the very beginning. We think of the counterculture in the mid 60s. I'm saying it started in the late 40s. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's undermining authority left and right. It didn't matter who.
Right.
You start with Alger Hiss, you finish with the United States Army. So he's creating a vacuum. I mean, why wouldn't you distrust this if some man with agency is telling you that they're traitors? I think that's, one of the things Hofstadter pointed out in that very famous essay, that the enemies were inside now. They weren't just around the fringes. And I think McCarthy opened that door.
It is fascinating to think that imagining that the enemies are inside is a way to, that way you don't have to understand the enemies outside, right? Because you can focus on enemies inside. You already speak their language, you already understand them. But it also then, it encourages a degree of, it's not that we have to change. It's not that we have to do anything differently. It's that, in fact, we have to pull together against this group that is out to get us. And even if we don't have to exactly explain, like, what possible interest does Dean Acheson have in encouraging Stalin to take over the world? It doesn't matter, right? He's got his fake mustache, his pencil mustache, and his fake English accent, and his striped pants, right? All the things that Joe McCarthy said. So you emphasize the eliteness and the cosmopolitanness of them, and just say, so look at them, look how terrible they are. Of course, they have to be enemies of the people.
No, and I think you're right. There's a quality in all of this, and I must have used the word Hofstadter 1,000 times in class, but there's this sense that you're right. You're the way of life, and that's a phrase you see endlessly, regardless of country or time. You're defending it against the threat, and you become a hero. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you're defining that threat as morally degenerate. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that applies to Dean, the Red Dean of fashion, Dean Acheson, with all the code words from the 50s about homophobia.
Right.
That applies to QAnon and satanic blood drinking, Philistines like, Anderson Cooper. So that's an extremely consistent theme, though, where you're, augmenting your own value as you defend. And it's very attractive. It's very attractive.
Well, because that idea, it's you mentioned there's a heroism in it. There's a Gnosticism in it, right? Because you're saying that, I have this secret knowledge. I know things that, and the idea that when you engage with people who believe certain things, right, their response to you will be, do the research, or I've done the research. And so that gets to the question of how should conversations go, right? And I'm going to try to head off any complaints about this program. I'm going to say, like, whatever you think about any particular approach, how should we imagine conversations between people who believe certain things and people who don't? You can't just go to somebody and say, you're wrong, you're stupid, you're crazy. What do you do?
And then you start that retaliatory internet thread that goes on for 3 hours.
That would be Twitter.
Yeah. And I've gotten swept up in that at points where you have to pull back and take a breath.
Right.
There was a term I think I used in the book that I learned in organizing classes. It's the 80-20 rule. And faculty are really bad at this. We're bad at listening. We love to talk. It's our stage. It's our theater. And one thing I always try to ask myself when I'm teaching students is what am I learning from them? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think to start with that idea, but I mean, Jordan Klepper does this really well in a funny way. When he asks a question, he's going to move it to the next level, beyond the slogan or the meme okay, what is the foundation of what you just said?
Right.
So what I try to do, I think what hopefully is useful is to try to get the conversation to move into why do you think that, not just what.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds very simple, but it requires something Americans really don't have, which is called patience. And that, I think, teachers can do that. And when I taught the class, we would actually have groups, one promoting, one debunking a conspiracy. And I'm basically teaching discourse.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's a learned skill. I mean, that's hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that, and I see we've got some questions coming in, and one of them I want to jump right on from Mike Noonan, and that is that Mike Noonan asks, in your research, how prevalent is the use of conspiracy theories by foreign actors as an element of statecraft? Examples like the KGB planting stories about the CIA bringing crack into the U.S., or one of my colleagues, Doug Selvage, has written a lot of work on the CIA, the KGB argument that the CIA created AIDS in a bio lab someplace. How do we understand the role, the weaponization of conspiracy theories? And while you start to answer, I'm going to open the blinds in my office. Go right ahead.
Yeah, as soon as you asked that question, I immediately thought of Jim Garrison and the theories about the CIA killing Kennedy. And when you start to trace the lineage of what they were back to where they came from, yeah, I mean, what we used to call white, gray, and black information is a constant. And I think it obviously predates the Cold War.
Right.
In one class, I have my students read the Joint Intelligence Report on the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. So we talk about that because, you can develop a meme that seems a lot like, Crystal from Missouri when it's probably Ivan from Belarus, who actually is that person. So, yeah, I think, the information age makes us focus on this, but, deliberate, psychological or operations or misinformation is a constant. I think it's a given.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, and if you can say things in a way that you have a sense that your target audience is likely to believe it, or at least enough of your target audience is likely to believe it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the story of the Zimmerman telegram. Absolutely.
An excellent example. A very successful information operation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Fritz Heinzen has a question and says, what do you think of the argument of one of his professors of diplomatic history, Vincent DeSantis, who in a course on the assassination of Lincoln and Kennedy argued that conspiracy believers could never accept the idea that one person could upset their world. It had to be a larger, much more powerful group. So in other words, it can't be Lee Harvey Oswald. It can't be just John Wilkes Booth. It has to be something bigger.
Yeah, I think it was on one of the anniversaries of Kennedy's death. I think William Manchester wrote an essay about that. And he said that, proportionality is the problem. Mm. How does this angry loner manage to kill the leader of the free world?
Right.
That lack of proportion, it intuitively doesn't make sense. It's like an itch you can't scratch.
Right.
So no, I completely agree with that. But you've also got this, problem when people look at government agencies or any power, they think it's infallible or omnipotent or even consistent, but it's not. I mean, that's one of the things I like talking about too, because one of the reasons you want to have a cover up is not to, avoid the conspiracy, it's to avoid culpability for screwing up. And that happens a lot. I mean, you've probably mentioned the phrase intelligence failure about 1 million times in your classes. So yeah, I mean, whether it's, the Navy trying to explain why Pearl Harbor or Hoover trying to explain how they managed to miss Oswald, the guy who lived in the Soviet Union who worked on the parade route and nobody managed to flag that.
Yeah.
That does happen though.
Right. Yeah, that's why your chapter on the JFK assassination really got me, because I really liked how you pointed out how the Warren Commission, even if the members of the Warren Commission were completely innocent of any evil intent, there were a lot of institutional pressures on the Warren Commission, right, to protect the Secret Service, to protect the FBI, to avoid saying things that they thought that they feared would inflame the country, and that in a way, right, the effort to try to shape the narrative, even if it's not necessarily aiming to be dishonest, it creates all of the holes or all of the things that then people can point out and say, well, why would they want, why aren't they talking more about this? Or why are they ignoring that? what did you think? Had you studied the JFK assassination much before you wrote the chapter in this book, or before you started teaching the class?
I kind of started with, the lineage, or the litany of potential culprits. And it went, I started with, Sam Giancana, the Defense Department. And I always finish with, Oliver Stone's theory that it was basically everybody working together. It's the Mr. X narrative from the movie.
Right.
But then, you get into, like the Warren Commission, where I think they're trying to tamp down panic. But what they did was they warped that report into a narrative that Mark Lane just drove a hole through. And especially when he looked at, impact of bullets instead of source of bullets.
Right.
So they're trying to simplify the story, and they open themselves up to, 3 generations of skeptics.
And you wonder, right? How could they have done it differently? So I've come at this from a different direction recently, because one of the members of the commission, John McCloy, is very important in my work on German-American relations. And so, and was Mr. Political Establishment. So clearly somebody who wants stable country, does not want anybody to panic. Somebody who would not, and a lot of the people on the commission, right? They would not have shied away if they'd been able to prove that the Soviets had done it. Right. Or that the Cubans had done it. But at the same time, right, they don't want to say anything irresponsible. And then you leave a lot of things unsaid. In some ways, right, we talk about the protocols for McCarthy, we go look for the beginning. But for particular generations of Americans, right, the everything comes back to the JFK assassination, right? The idea that the world changed on that day at that moment.
And that's become canon, basically. When did the 60s start? I mean, how many times have you heard and said that? But yeah, if you look at the context, we're a little over a year removed from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Checkpoint Charlie, which most of my students have never heard of, is a obvious hot, tripwire. And these, I think the leadership in general, especially in a transition of power, to a president, I don't know if they had complete, in Lyndon Johnson, they had complete faith in. They're trying almost desperately to keep continuity. So, I mean, there's always there's reasons and methods, and they're creating blind spots based on their intentions. Right. Hindsight's great, but if I'm looking at 1964, I mean, I can see a lot of that.
Right. And also, one thing just occurred to me, actually sitting here talking about this, going to Fritz's question about or comment about JFK and Lincoln. There was a conspiracy around the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, right? It was supposed to be a coordinated series of assassinations. And I think that's something, ironically, that many Americans aren't completely up on. An honest to goodness effort to overthrow the government by murdering the president, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, all on the same day, Secretary of War, all on the same day.
Oh, absolutely. And I talk about this, during the Cold War. I mean, assassination is official policy until Gerald Ford. So, why is the CIA so concerned about, not revealing this? Is I actually don't know how many programs they had that were active in 1964. The Church Committee revealed a lot of that, and it's kind of astounding reading. But yeah, I mean, whether it's 1865 or 1965, this is a method of policy. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and to jump ahead a little bit, Colin Agee asks an interesting question, and that is, there is a perception, and with some basis in fact in some circles, that fact checking or fact checkers are partisan and that they can't be trusted, right? And this gets to the question of, how should we figure out, like, how do you respond to a conspiracy theory or to a series of beliefs about politics if they are identified with a particular political movement? And that movement says, obviously, if you're trying to poke holes in this because you don't agree, not because you're in the service of some kind of objective truth. So how do we manage this? How do we deal with issues like disinformation? And as Colin notes, right, literally today, the person the president had appointed to be the head of the disinformation governance board decided to quit because of the huge political backlash against it.
Yeah, they really should have focus grouped that title.
Right.
Well, I mean, one of the actually unintentionally hilarious parts of teaching this class is I've been accused of being a disinformation shill in final exams. I mean, I've had students just denounce me, which is kind of fun.
in their essays on the exam.
Oh yeah.
Oh man.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So keep those.
Well, they got the terminology right. I mean, I'm proud of them. I guess there's a lot of answers to that. Where to even start with it? I think you go back to the rules of logic. And this is where I dip into the well we had in grad school.
Mhm, mhm.
Causation is one thing, multi-causation is another. So you start bringing in sources to build that platform where you're going to have, corroboration and causation that start to combine. So that's important. Instead of picking your single source or your clickbait or the one superficial observation or anomaly hunting, I mean, stringing together, these weird correlations that can add up to almost anything.
Right.
There's a great website about spurious correlations, where they have like Nicolas Cage movies and deaths by drowning, and it's hilarious.
I've
right?
seen those amazing graphs that show the
Yeah.
lines are almost exactly following each other.
So I think the rules of logic pertain regardless of what side you're on. I mean, those are your yardsticks, and
Mhm.
partisanship really, they can bend those things, but they can't break them. But the other thing I also tell the kids, I said, or anybody reading, the book, you're never going to have 100% knowledge of what happened. You have to treat these stories like you're on a jury. You have to decide what is sufficient. And that really is important because, the lack of perfection isn't failure. There's that, threshold I think people have to reach where they're satisfied. And if they're not, then they keep doing the research. But that's important too, because sometimes the sources evolve. They definitely did with Kennedy.
Right. For sure. Well, and we're at that funny moment as well, where we realize that you shouldn't assume malevolence when incompetence can be an equally accurate explanation.
Yeah.
The idea about why and the is I would say Richard Hall mentions, right, that the going back to the idea that the Warren Commission may have helped to create conspiracy culture because of all the pressures that they were under, and this creates a problem for all commissions, right? Is that if a commission is supposed to create an official story, whether it's about the Kennedy assassination or about 9/11, there's always going to be the danger that somebody's going to say, well, it's the official story, and therefore it must be some kind of cover-up, because that's what cover-ups are all about. Should we, Richard suggests that commissions must be composed of disinterested specialists, not politicians. But can commissions solve these questions? This goes back to a question I think we talked about right on the list before we got started of, can conspiracy theories ever be resolved, right? Is there a way that people can say, oh, we don't have to believe that anymore? Because I'm thinking no, but maybe you know better than I do. I mean, if we had a perfect commission of time travelers who are able to go back and be in the textbook depository and say, look, there's shot 1, shot 2, shot 3. It was Oswald. Would we be satisfied? Could we be satisfied?
No, because I think there's doubt that's not always based on intellect. I mean, I go back to this idea of skepticism as a survival mechanism. I mean, we're never wholly trusting of anything just by and for sometimes good reasons.
Yeah.
So we could assemble the biggest, best blue ribbon panel there ever was and definitively make a conclusion, and it still might fail. I always think of the second Congressional Committee on Assassinations that looked at Kennedy and what they had at their disposal. And, Gerald Posner wrote that book. I mean, the technology was really impressive, but a few years down the road, it was also contested by more academics with better methods. So it's a moving target. I mean, that's just the reality.
Yeah. Heather Salazar asked a question that I had hoped would be asked, and about your teaching of this and your engagement with students over the past 6 years. And she asks, was there one conspiracy theory that students seemed to gravitate to more than another? And how did students connect these theories with more recent events and their views on society in general, right? Are there stories that the students they really get into and they say, well, that's not a conspiracy theory, Professor Gambone, that's the truth?
Yeah, it's interesting. Heather was one of my students now.
No wonder.
Yes.
Well played, Heather Salazar. Well played.
She knows me too well. So when we did the group projects where they would be advocates for conspiracies, the moon landing was very popular.
Oh, really? The moon landing. Oh man.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And then, you get into, so generally you can say that, the government, approached the moon landing and basically it was a giant example of fraud, but then you have to give specific examples, and that's where the debate starts.
Right.
So we're back into that, regime of evidence and claim. And that's fascinating too, because a lot of that stuff's very technical.
The angle of the sun, the quality of the images,
the type of camera used, to make the photographs, or the flag moving in a vacuum. So that kind of thing, we get into the weeds really quickly, but I think it's very useful because you're exposing, and I like this, you're exposing people to fields of study they probably never even thought about.
Right. Do you have a repertoire and you pick certain ones for the class when you teach it, or is it always the same ones?
I actually added a bunch toward the end that bring us almost up to the present day with the 2020 election and QAnon. And that was as a result of the book, because I have to recognize that these things are evolving too. So my case studies that's moving as well. The kids were kind of fascinated with QAnon and what it meant. They're also fascinated with Watergate, and the question I kept getting was, how are they so bad at conspiracies? They were like appalled at how bad the Nixon administration was at being bad.
Right.
It's almost like the John Oliver stupid Watergate show he did, and but they're like incredulous that G. Gordon Liddy was so bad at his job. Which kind of goes back to this problem of a conspiracy when you think they're omnipotent, but they're also incompetent.
Right. Because they were, I mean, why, they put tape on the door. That allowed the security guard to see it. And they even had the whole reason why they got caught was because they had to go back a second time to put in the bugs they put in the first time, which weren't working properly.
Yeah.
Now, we could go on about that. The Watergate interests me for that reason too, especially because it is because of Watergate that you get a renewed desire to investigate these other things, right? There's no church commission without Watergate.
Nope. And you also get Roger Stone who's had multiple leases on life ever since. Indeed,
continues to work on that. Lawrence Husick asks a question that gets to sort of a meta question, and it's. He says the United States is both less religious and more fundamental at the same time. What's the role of faith, religious faith, in conspiracy theories? And he doesn't ask this, but I will piggyback on this. Is in your studies, is American society especially fond or especially susceptible to conspiracy theories? Or how do we compare to the rest of the world when it comes to believing these days, when it comes to believing conspiracies?
Yeah, I love your multi-part 9-layer questions, Ron. So
you said you mentioned professors like to talk too much. I'm sorry, man.
If I could remember that. I'll start with the idea of maybe faith and conspiracies. I think it really goes back to this idea of a moral cause where you're trying to either protect or defend righteousness.
Yeah,
I found that element in almost every one we've talked about. That could be the Nixon White House in 1969 defending America against the left. It's McCarthy against degenerate communists undercutting American society. It's QAnon. I mean, the natural parenting movement that gets sucked into that starts with the premise of defending children, which is a good cause that can be very easily warped. So that's constant. I don't think it's limited to America. This is obviously, QAnon spread to multiple countries as an example, but all these characteristics exist everywhere in the world. So I don't think any of this is uniquely American.
Interesting. So and the idea that the moral element is in that, people who believe things, they believe because they think this is a truth that needs to get out, that's being suppressed by them, whoever they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes this is where the idea, so much of your book, I would submit, because you talk about at the beginning and at the end about how the best way to handle, or the best way to deal with these kinds of fundamental disagreements about what happened and why it happened is to be open to discussion, and that discussion will help. Right? I don't know if discussion is not going to resolve these things, but that it will help. What happens if conspiratorial thinking is simply allowed to develop? If people just say, well, let's put that over, let those people over in the corner talk all they want about this or that crazy belief. We're just not going to engage it at all. We're going to ignore it. We're not going to put these people on TV. We're not going to write about them. We're just going to let them continue to believe whatever they believe. What would that do?
Well, when I was at Penn State, we had a street preacher named Bro Co who would, get on his soapbox and regale the students changing classes with his, theories. And we just relegated him to the periphery,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's partly what people hope. But I think the problem is, and this was a problem with QAnon. I mean, when Christopher Wray was testifying about QAnon 3 years ago, he was describing it in those terms. I mean, it's a fringe movement. It's, not really a threat, but I think what they didn't understand was how quickly it could evolve using the very platforms it was, communicating with, and it began to organize. And I think that's what we saw on January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when you think about the public figures like the current Republican, gubernatorial candidate, providing agency and acclamation to these things, they're not dormant.
Mm-hmm.
They evolve in ways that make their breadth and depth become a huge problem. So I don't think that's something you can just hope for, cross fingers, hope for the best. I think that's something I think we all understand, especially after last year.
Right. Well, and Ethan Cullen actually asked a question specifically about this with January 6th. Is what do you have a chapter about 2020 election conspiracies. And about 2016, and about how on both left and right, there was a willingness to believe the worst about one's opponents. In what ways can or should the public or institutions like universities, like discussions here at FPRI, should we be directly engaging with the conspiracy theories about stolen elections? Without going back to the earlier question about that there would be some sort of political bias in fact checking these things, right? How are we supposed to talk about this when we're going to have an election in November, and we're going to have another election 2 years after that, and we don't know right now whether people will be willing to accept an election that they lose?
I was an election official yesterday, hearing exactly the same things. I think one of the things that 2020 taught me is that you do have, this came up repeatedly, the acid test of an election claim is a court of law. And it is very different from a Senate committee or a MSNBC or any other type of platform where the evidence rules the day. And that's where you start talking about the, second, third, fourth levels of what this, claim means. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And like I talk to my kids about Pennsylvania election law, like when do you count a mail-in ballot? And a lot of them have no idea when the count starts. So just being able to tell them that by law, what state law requires, that explains why the later returns manifested like they did. Right.
Because they couldn't be counted until after the other ballots had been counted, right? Yeah. Right.
Very different than Florida, which ironically is very liberal when it comes to voting. But you start with information, and then you start dealing with, the depth of the claim. And I think what I really hope people do is not let this discussion, live in the realm of clickbait and that meme. I think that's the worst way to discuss anything.
Right. Well, and you mentioned in the book too, that this was the pressure that some of the advocates of the conspiracy theories about the 2020 election ran into, is when they appeared in court and they were expected to provide evidence, they were unable to do so, or they made declarations that judges very quickly pushed aside. Colin follows up and says, are you familiar with the movie 2000 Mules? Are you planning on watching it and or showing it to your students?
I've shown a lot of, internet, I'm not going to call them documentaries. So we've used Loose Change. We've used What in the World Are They Spraying? Mm-hmm. So what we do is, and this is something else, I have time to do in class. I can pause the movie and ask them questions about, the process, the method, and the evidence.
Yeah.
And say, well, is this just a stream of consciousness Gish Gallop? I mean, what are they actually using to prove what they're saying? So likely, probably I will. But again, with that caveat, I want the kids to pause and think. So, yeah.
Right. I have, let me see, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I've got two pretty big questions here. And I want to hit this one from David Rosenberg, who he raises the issue that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, well, in the United States, this is, a sort of crank idea, but of course it has, it's part of a longer story of anti-Semitism, which leads to the horrible crimes of the Holocaust. And yet the other things that we are talking about here can be seen as he puts it, peripheral or exotic crank ideas with little long-term significance. How should we how can we, or how should we distinguish between ideas and beliefs that have heavy significance and so therefore need to be responded to more aggressively, versus if people want to believe the earth is flat and talk about it among themselves, or what do we care? How do we differentiate between the two?
No, and honestly, that's something I've been learning as I've gone through this over the years. And one of the realizations I came with something like QAnon.
Mm-hmm.
It almost defines the crank fringe idea that has no relevance, and it invites ridicule. But I think the key idea here is that if you have an idea that people are willing to act on and be part of policy, or is going to warp nationalism or race and into a policy of itself, that's what links the protocols with QAnon. Mm. Because you've got that exact dynamic after World War I, specifically with the Nazi Party. And you can identify elements of that trend all throughout the 20s, the 30s, and onward. And you can also identify the consequences. Mm-hmm. So when I look at something like QAnon, I can use a nonprofit like Media Matters and determine that you've got, I think it's 97 candidates who ran in 2020, and 89 of them were Republicans who believed in QAnon. And that's an incredible number, where they're folding in that conspiracy right into their campaign structure. And that's a huge flag. Right. It goes back to some of the warning signs that the world had in the 20s or 30s. And now we've got hindsight and perspective. So I think if you look, apply these types of qualities, I think that's where this becomes very important.
Mm-hmm. Because we don't know what, especially once they find their way into political rhetoric and into political campaigns, we don't know where they end. If they can end in violence.
Right. And I think for like the January 6th riots, I mean, it was amazing to see how much metadata you could find that would actually track the people with their cell phones from the rally in front of the ellipse to the Capitol. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you could literally draw a map of who participated, or to make it easier, people like our Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania were posting selfies, so they made it very easy.
Yes.
The New York Times did a great documentary on that. Staggering. I mean, how much information you could get from the participants.
Right. That when people are not hiding, or they're not shy about their belief. That is a very interesting thing. And yet, in a paradoxical way, often when people are very upfront about their beliefs, if those beliefs come across as exotic or strange, that sometimes is treated by the broader public as proof that they're somehow harmless. I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about that, to use David's example, right, with Mein Kampf, right? The idea of people read it and they say, well, come on, and no, he can't possibly really believe these things, or he can't possibly want to put these things into practice.
But that's the key, though, because once they put them into practice, I mean, the term I write Latin on the board periodically, but that's where the facts speak for themselves. And we haven't brought this up yet, but that's why everybody in the country is beginning to understand what replacement theory is right now.
Right.
Because that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that, but also Joseph Della Penna has an interesting question that I want us to address. And that is, he says, in the summer of 1991, I sat next to the Minister of Water Resources of Jordan at a luncheon when he confidently assured me that the first Gulf War was a conspiracy between Bush and Hussein to extend U.S. influence in the Middle East. Have you ever heard that one before? And more importantly, would you say that the Middle East is particularly prone to conspiracy theories?
Oh, absolutely. The Bush family has become a touchstone for conspiracies, before, during, and after 9/11. Absolutely. And I think, societies with long histories and, of everything we're talking about. I mean, I look at the United States, we're in terms of history, we're amateurs at a lot of the things we're talking about. Mm-hmm. To hold a grudge in this country means it was less than 1,000 years. And I remember hearing those stories in Iraq. How long have you been celebrating the assassination of this judge? Oh, about 1,000 years. I mean, we have to catch up with the world when it comes to qualities like that. Mm-hmm. So no, it doesn't surprise me at all. And I think one of the things David Aranovich and Catherine Olmsted brought up was how readily available Middle Eastern nations are to promote, protocols, conspiracy theories well into this century. I mean, it's pretty well known.
Yeah. And there's a connection also, I guess, between when you have political systems that do not allow for a lot of direct political participation, that the general public is going to spend their time looking for, trying to either identify or even to denounce secret patterns in decision making. Fritz Heinzen asked about the course readings for your course, and so should we tell people that if they want to know the course readings for your course, they should get themselves a copy of Modern Conspiracies in America, or is there a particular text or texts that you make sure that your students read?
Well, you could take a wild guess that they'll have a new text next year. No, I used the starting book I used it's Catherine Olmsted's book, Real Enemies.
Real Enemies,
Yeah, and it's a great book. David Aranovic's book, Voodoo History, also a great book. If we manage to get the panel accepted, we're going to be on a panel, Catherine Olmsted and I, next year at OAH to talk about this. She's been great. Otherwise, like I said, I've dipped into psychology. Rob Brotherton's book, Suspicious Minds, very good book. There's another book, I can't honestly think of the authors. It's called Denying to the Grave. And it talks about the physiology of conspiracies, which is also kind of fascinating. So
when you say the physiology of conspiracies, what do you mean?
It's basically, brain functions, endorphins, and rewards you get for, thought. I mean, again, I would have never thought of this, as a historian, but all this relates,
Yeah. It feels good. It feels good to feel like you know something other people don't know.
Yeah. I mean, how many studies of Twitter have focused on that exact, that process for young minds? Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. You get a thrill every time somebody responds to you. Richard Hall notes for Replacement Theory, The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant, written back in 1922, which is, what's old is new. When we are afraid of the present, we're afraid about the future, we try to find, I don't know, either solace or anger in the past.
Yeah, Rich is a extremely well-read friend of mine. I'm very jealous of his library.
And it's funny. And you mentioned social media, that just this morning on Twitter, because of course, I spend part of my day on Twitter because I'm an academic and that's the law. After I listen to NPR, also the law. But there is some people talking about how there's a reference in The Great Gatsby that Tom Buchanan, when he first sits down with Nick Carraway early in the book, he says, "Have you read this book, The Rising Empire of Color, by this man Stoddard," or this man he mentioned gets the name wrong. And it raises all these questions, right? When Fitzgerald puts that kind of opinion in the mouth of the one person in the book that we are supposed to dislike, is he making him that much more dislikable, or is he just letting us know that when people sat down on West Egg or East Egg for lunch, that this is exactly what they would talk about, is racist conspiracy worries about immigrants? Yeah.
It's funny if you're willing to admit how people actually did think back then. Absolutely. Right. I mean, you've heard enough stories about Teddy Roosevelt and, his race theory. I admire that president, but ye gods, what was conventional wisdom, back in those times.
Right. And I guess to bring it all, we've got about 5 minutes to go. And but to bring it all to a conclusion, you're going to be teaching this class next year. You're going to be teaching this class going forward. What is the thing that students mostly say after they have taken the class? Do they find that I didn't know that people believed these things? Or do they say, thanks for clearing it up, I always wondered whether we landed on the moon?
When the class was small, I actually used to use it was a PPP survey about conspiracies, and I would give it to the class before and then after to see what changed. And I might reinstitute that just so I can kind of quantify the shift. But I think some of them, it does change in some ways. I don't think there's a guarantee. I think what I really appreciate is the fact that they learn more about some of these events and they get angry and they want to know more. Mm-hmm. And I mean, angry in a way that, they're incredulous about some of the people. James Fetzer and Sandy Hook. Mm-hmm. I had them read a chapter from that book, and students were they're almost furious with what an academic did with that story. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, he's one of us, and look at what happened. And so I think that maybe inspires, I think, down the line. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm. And that's the idea, right? Is that to encourage students to be, that skepticism ain't a bad thing, right? And skepticism about official stories also is not a bad thing, but skepticism about unofficial stories is kind of important too.
Well, and at the end of the day, I mean, it's funny because all this critical thinking we keep lambasting. You know, I said the only thing you have to worry about if your professor has a bow tie, that's the only bad sign. You know? Because you know who they are, Ron.
I do, you know, and I'm glad I kicked that habit back in 1995. But Mike Gambone, this conversation has been great. It's a delight to see you again after quite some time. But thanks very much for joining us to talk about your book. And ladies and gentlemen, the book again is Modern Conspiracies in America: Separating Fact from Fiction, from Rowman and Littlefield. It is available for purchase in your favorite bookstore or other online outlet, and I encourage you to go out and get it and to read more of what you've heard today. I've got messages coming in from Science and other people say thanks a lot, Mike, for joining us, and thanks to you, all of you, for joining us for this conversation. I'm afraid this conversation is over, but it's always a pleasure to have you with us. As a representative of FPRI, let me remind you all that if you enjoyed this conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we're always here to discuss it at FPRI. If you liked what you've heard today, please tell a friend. Please bring a friend next time. Please consider becoming a member, partner, supporter, subscriber of FPRI in any way that you can in order to help support the work that we do so that we can have more conversations like this. Please follow us on Twitter, friend us on Facebook, go to our website, fpri.org, to keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose or other events at FPRI. You can follow the host of this program, as I said, on Twitter, at Ronald Granieri. But we'll see you again next month on People, Politics, and Prose. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks, Mike.